Prophecy decoded. Decoded the past, reveal the future.
Empires rise from dust and crumble back to earth. Nations carve their names into history only to watch them fade into forgotten whispers. Kingdoms claim eternal glory while their borders dissolve beneath the relentless march of time. But there is one nation whose destiny was written in sacred scrolls before its people ever walked the frozen steppes, before its cities touched the sky, before its name echoed through the halls of earthly power. Today, for the first time, archaeological discoveries from the depths of Siberian kurgans have unlocked prophetic secrets that connect Russia's ancient bloodlines directly to biblical prophecy. Hidden within the pages of Ezekiel and sealed in the visions of two Esdras lie geographic coordinates, tribal identities, and spiritual destinies that point with startling precision to the vast territories we now know as Russia. These aren't just academic theories or speculative interpretations. They are prophetic revelations preserved in manuscripts that survived the destruction of temples, the burning of libraries, and the persecution of prophets across millennia of human history. What emerges from this convergence of ancient scripture and modern discovery defies natural explanation and points to divine orchestration that spans from the Babylonian exile to the threshold of Christ's return. The same prophetic patterns that identified Israel's restoration now reveal Russia's appointed role in the final chapters of human history, when nations gather for purposes that only heaven fully comprehends. Scripture declares in Daniel 12, "For that, in the last, knowledge shall increase and hidden truths shall be revealed." As we stand in 2025, watching prophetic timelines converge with unprecedented archaeological validation, the destiny of Russia encoded in ancient biblical texts signals not just historical curiosity, but spiritual preparation for events that will reshape the entire geopolitical landscape, according to divine design rather than human planning. Picture this moment when the prophet Ezekiel, writing from Babylonian captivity in the 6th century before Christ, received visions that would echo through corridors of time until they found their fulfillment in territories so vast and remote that ancient scribes could barely comprehend their scope. The Hebrew phrase from the far north that appears repeatedly in Ezekiel 38 carries geographical precision that modern satellite mapping has confirmed points directly toward the heartland of what we now call Russia. Archaeological teams working in the Altai Mountains have uncovered Scythian burial sites containing artifacts that biblical scholars are calling the missing link between Old Testament prophecy and Russian ethnic origins. These aren't random nomadic graveyards but carefully constructed monuments that preserve cultural data connecting ancient biblical peoples to the ancestors of modern Slavic civilization. You won't believe what researchers discovered when they analyzed burial practices found in 7th century BC kurgans scattered across southern Russia and Ukraine. The ceremonial objects, the positioning of remains, and even the astronomical alignments matched descriptions found in biblical texts describing the northern peoples who would play decisive roles in end times events that no human government can prevent or manipulate. Here's the astounding part about these prophetic connections. The Hebrew word Magog that appears in Ezekiel 38, 2 doesn't just represent a mysterious distant land but carries geometry of values that correspond with specific historical dates when Russian territories experienced supernatural interventions that changed the course of world history. Biblical numerology encoded in ancient manuscripts reveals patterns that align with Russia's emergence as a world power according to prophetic timelines that no human strategist could orchestrate. Consider this reality as we examine how Scythian migrations documented by both archaeological evidence and historical chronicles trace the movement of biblical peoples from the ancient Near East into territories that would eventually become the foundation of Russian civilization. These weren't random wanderings but divinely orchestrated relocations that positioned specific ethnic groups in geographical regions where they would fulfill prophetic purposes that stretch from ancient biblical times into our current generation. Something extraordinary happened around 988 that biblical scholars are still processing. The mass baptism of Kievan Rus under Prince Vladimir wasn't just a political conversion or cultural shift, but the prophetic fulfillment of restoration promises that Ezekiel described when he spoke of northern peoples being gathered from among the nations and experiencing spiritual renewal that would prepare them for end times roles that most contemporary observers completely misunderstand. The primary chronicle records this event using language that mirrors biblical descriptions of covenant making between God and chosen peoples. The chroniclers weren't simply documenting political history but preserving prophetic fulfillment that demonstrates divine faithfulness spanning centuries between promise and performance according to heavenly timelines rather than human expectations. However, there is one truth that changes everything about how we understand Russia's biblical destiny. The Orthodox Christianity that took root in Russian soil didn't represent foreign religious importation, but the restoration of spiritual connections that traced back through Byzantine traditions to the original apostolic communities that maintained biblical truth while Western Christianity was developing in different directions. Archaeological evidence from 11th century Orthodox monasteries reveals manuscript preservation practices that protected biblical texts and prophetic interpretations through centuries of political upheaval, foreign invasion, and cultural transformation. These monastic libraries served as prophetic repositories that maintained ancient wisdom specifically for end-times revelation when global events would require spiritual understanding that transcends political analysis. But what Scripture reveals about the timing of these historical developments reaches far beyond medieval history into contemporary prophetic significance. The emergence of Russia as a world power during the exact chronological period when biblical prophecy indicates northern nations would rise to prominence demonstrates divine orchestration that operates according to celestial calendars rather than earthly political calculations. The Hebrew text of Ezekiel 38. A people gathered from many nations who would inhabit lands that had been continually desolate but would experience restoration in the latter years. Historical analysis of Russian territorial expansion reveals settlement patterns that match this prophetic description with precision that defies coincidental explanation. Researchers have documented how Russian civilization emerged from the convergence of multiple ethnic streams including Slavic, Turkic, Mongol, and other tribal elements that biblical prophecy describes as the gathering of northern peoples from among diverse nations. This wasn't gradual cultural evolution but prophetic assembling that positioned Russia for end-times roles that contemporary geopolitical analysis consistently fails to anticipate. Time is running shorter, as we recognize that Russia's unique position spanning 11 time zones, from Europe to the Pacific, represents more than geographical vastness but strategic positioning that biblical prophecy indicates will be crucial during final global conflicts, when traditional Western power structures face challenges that no human military or economic strategy can resolve. Here's the mind-blowing part about this prophetic revelation. The Khazar kingdom that dominated territories between the Black Sea and Caspian Sea from the 8th through 10th centuries provides archaeological evidence for Jewish cultural influence in regions that would later become integral parts of Russian civilization. Hebrew inscriptions discovered in Khazar fortifications demonstrate biblical literacy among populations that would contribute genetic and cultural elements to emerging Russian ethnic identity. Recent excavations in Dagestan have uncovered Khazar sites containing synagogue foundations, Jewish ceremonial objects, and Hebrew manuscripts that prove biblical tradition was actively maintained in territories that ancient prophets identified as the lands of northern peoples who would participate in latter-day events described throughout apocalyptic literature. This is the sign we've been watching for in these last days. The archaeological validation of prophetic geography that connects biblical texts to modern nations in ways that silence skeptical criticism while strengthening faith in divine sovereignty over human history. The evidence emerging from Russian archaeological sites provides physical confirmation for spiritual truths that previous generations could only accept through faith rather than empirical demonstration. You must understand that, when biblical prophets described northern peoples who would march toward Israel in the last days, they weren't speaking in symbolic or metaphorical terms but providing literal geographical coordinates that modern mapping technology confirms point toward Russian territories with accuracy that ancient navigation systems could never achieve through human calculation. Prepare your spirit because what we're witnessing in our current era represents the fulfillment of prophetic processes that began when the first Scythian nomads carried cultural memories from biblical lands into territories so remote that ancient cartographers could barely conceive their existence. Every major development in Russian history, from the formation of Kievan Rus through Orthodox Christianization to emergence as a global superpower, represents prophetic progression according to divine timelines that operate independently of human political planning. These events are accelerating rapidly, as we observe how contemporary geopolitical tensions involving Russia consistently align with biblical descriptions of northern nations playing decisive roles in end-time scenarios that will demonstrate divine sovereignty over earthly kingdoms regardless of their military strength, economic resources, or technological capabilities. The window of preparation is narrowing as Russia's prophetic destiny encoded in ancient scriptures moves from historical curiosity toward contemporary reality. The archaeological evidence we've examined from Scythian burial sites to Orthodox monasteries provides overwhelming confirmation that biblical prophecy operates with mathematical precision across vast spans of time and geographical distance. Picture this scenario when modern believers realize that Russia's complex relationship with Israel, its Orthodox Christian heritage, and its strategic geographical position represent prophetic elements that biblical seers described centuries before Russian civilization emerged from the steppes. These connections weren't developed through human diplomacy but established through divine providence that positions nations according to heavenly purposes rather than earthly ambitions. Biblical numerology preserved in Hebrew manuscripts reveals that Russia's key historical dates align with prophetic cycles that demonstrate supernatural timing behind events that secular historians explain through purely political or economic analysis. The patterns are too precise, too consistent, and too prophetically significant to represent mere historical coincidence. You won't believe what they discovered next when researchers began comparing Russian Orthodox theological traditions with ancient biblical interpretations preserved in manuscripts that survived the destruction of Jerusalem and the dispersion of early Christian communities. The theological continuity suggests that Russian Orthodox Christianity maintained prophetic understanding that Western Christianity gradually lost through institutional compromises and theological innovations. Here's the astounding part about this spiritual continuity. Russian Orthodox monasteries preserved apocalyptic literature, prophetic commentaries, and eschatological interpretations that specifically identified their homeland as playing crucial roles in events leading toward Christ's return. These weren't nationalistic interpretations but biblical exegesis that recognized prophetic geography pointing toward northern territories. Consider this reality as we examine how Russian literary traditions, from Dostoevsky to Solzhenitsyn, consistently reflect theological themes that parallel biblical descriptions of nations chosen for prophetic purposes while struggling with spiritual responsibilities that exceed their natural capabilities. This literary witness provides cultural validation for archaeological evidence pointing toward Russia's biblical destiny. This moment changes everything as we recognize that Russia's preservation of Orthodox Christianity through centuries of persecution, its survival of devastating wars and political upheavals, and its emergence as a nuclear superpower represent prophetic resilience that demonstrates divine protection over nations appointed for end-times roles regardless of their human weaknesses or political mistakes. The truth that transforms our understanding of contemporary geopolitics is that Russia's prophetic destiny operates independently of its current political leadership, economic conditions, or military strategy. Biblical prophecy focuses on geographical territories, ethnic populations, and spiritual heritage rather than temporary governmental structures that change according to human political cycles. Archaeological investigations continue to validate biblical prophecy by revealing cultural connections between ancient Near Eastern peoples and populations that eventually settled throughout Russian territories. These discoveries provide physical evidence for spiritual truths that enable modern believers to understand current events through prophetic frameworks rather than purely secular analysis. Here's what will astound you about the divine opportunity presented to believers in 2025. You have access to archaeological evidence, historical documentation, and prophetic interpretation that previous generations could only imagine. The convergence of ancient biblical texts with modern scientific discovery provides unprecedented confirmation that divine prophecy operates according to supernatural intelligence that encompasses millennia of human history while maintaining precise accuracy in every detail. Your role in understanding Russia's biblical destiny involves more than academic curiosity or geopolitical analysis. You are called to recognize prophetic fulfillment occurring in real time, to understand contemporary events through biblical frameworks, and to prepare spiritually for prophetic developments that will affect every nation on earth according to divine purposes that transcend human political planning. The archaeological treasures we've examined from Scythian steppes to Orthodox monasteries belong to every believer who seeks to understand divine sovereignty over human history. The prophetic patterns encoded in biblical texts, and validated through physical evidence demonstrate that God works through specific nations and territories to accomplish purposes that serve His ultimate plan for human redemption and global restoration. Study the ancient scriptures with fresh understanding that Russian destiny was written in biblical prophecy before Moscow existed, before Orthodox Christianity spread across the steppes, before nuclear weapons made Russia a global superpower. The same divine intelligence that positioned Israel at the crossroads of ancient civilizations positioned Russia at the crossroads of end times geopolitics for purposes that only heaven fully comprehends, but that faithful believers can discern through careful study of prophetic scripture validated by archaeological discovery. Share this revelation with others who need to understand that contemporary geopolitics operate according to biblical prophecy rather than purely secular analysis. The destiny of Russia written in ancient scriptures affects every believer who recognizes that we live in prophetic times when ancient promises find their fulfillment in ways that demonstrate divine faithfulness spanning millennia of human history, while pointing toward ultimate restoration when Christ returns to establish His kingdom over all earthly nations. The prophecies of Ezekiel echo through time, preserved in ancient manuscripts, validated by archaeological evidence, confirmed through historical analysis, and made available to you for understanding that reaches far beyond academic study into spiritual preparation for events that will reshape human civilization according to divine design rather than human planning. Start studying today, and discover that the destiny of nations has always been written in the pages of Scripture for those who seek prophetic truth with passionate determination and biblical understanding that transcends purely political analysis.